So I want to welcome everybody tonight to the fourth collaboration between the Randall Library and Sustainable Stow. This has been a great experience for me. I've learned a lot, and we're so happy to welcome our guest speakers tonight, Dan Barstow, David Gray, and Kirk Westphal. Just some housekeeping notes. This is being recorded by Stow TV. And we would ask that if you have a question, you wait until the end. If you could raise your virtual hand or just your hand like this, we'd be more than happy to answer your questions. If you feel that the question is very critical to what is being discussed at the moment, feel free and we'll answer, but it just might be easier if we wait until the end. So I think with that, I can pass it off to Rick.
Thank you, Tina. Yeah, I'm a member of Sustainable Stow, and we've been organizing this series of talks. This is our fourth. And we're trying to design talks that are relevant to the climate crisis we face, that are directly relevant to concerns in Stow, and also have, sort of immediate homeowner or resident connections. And so, we all benefit from Lake Boone, but Lake Boone is a much bigger concern than just, we go swimming there in the summer. So we'll be interested to hear what we learned tonight. This series continues every month. And just so you get an idea of what's coming up next month, we've been shooting at various locations around Stow. And we're going to doing a program on making your yard work for you and for the environment. And we have a landscape architect named Casey Lee Bestian, who's going to be our speaker. It'll be very interesting, I guarantee. So, Barbara, over to you and the crew for our talk tonight.
All right, thank you. So tonight we're going to hear about a project to research and make recommendations to protect Lake Boone in the face of a changing climate. The Healthy Lake Boone project is grant funded through the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. It's supported by a lot of volunteer hours, and as well as donations from Stow residents on and off the lake. And the goal here is to come up with measures that are supported by science and by the community to help keep the lake healthy in the face of what we really expect to be hotter summers, warmer winters, fiercer storms, more irregular precipitation, and so forth. And so our speakers tonight are Dan Barstow, who is the grant manager. Dan has a background in science education, most recently focused on STEM fields. He's a member of the Lake Boone Commission, where he serves as the clerk, and he also manages the annual lake drawdown. Dave Gray is a retired engineer and long-term treasurer for the Lake Boone Association. He is a former volunteer water quality monitor for ORS, and is the liaison to the Lake Boone Association on this grant. And Kirk Westphal is the technical lead and is a professional engineer with Brown and Caldwell, which is the consulting company that's working on the grant with the volunteers. He develops regional water plans, focusing on building consensus among different stakeholders with possibly competing water use issues. There's probably a little bit of that on the lake as well. And he's worked in 28 states and is now working on one with his neighbors in Stow. And he's also a musician and an author. And if you come down to the lake for the Water Carnival music boat, the Friday of Labor Day weekend, you can hear his band on the music boat. So that will be great. And so thank you all for joining us tonight, and take it away.
Okay, well, why don't I begin? There's going to be one presentation by three people. Let me first share my screen and make sure we're doing well with that. Hold on a second. Okay, you should see Healthy Lake Boone Initiative, do you? Okay, so we received a grant in October of 2020 of $154,000 to study the health of Lake Boone. It's actually quite an interesting challenge. It's a very important climate project. It builds on a wide range of prior work over the years, but is a very intensely focused piece of study. Just a little bit more on my background, just for information that, a lake resident for some 30 years, love the lake, but I've been involved in climate for, a fair amount of my career. Most recently working with the International Space Station, helping the astronauts do Earth photography that helps us perceive the global perspective of these issues. Also helped found the National Climate Literacy Network. But really, I'm fascinated by the opportunity to focus very specifically on, our local community. And I'm so impressed with the caliber of the work that you all have been doing to this point. The presentation today will have three parts. I'm going to do a little bit of project overview. Kirk will discuss the climate modeling that's at the heart of this, and we'll discuss the climate connections. And third, Dave Gregg will talk about the data collection and early results from our citizen science program. So first, let's begin. Lake Boone is a wonderful place. I'm sure you've all either live or have visited. It's not just for the people who live around the lake. It's a resource for Stow and Hudson and the larger community. It's some 160 or so acres, has 4 basins. It really is quite a beautiful place for recreation, for enjoyment, and a water resource for the community. It is, here you can see the structure of it, where people live around the lake, access to the Pine Bluff recreational area, the town beach. There's a docking, a launching a ramp for boats, but it has a wide range of uses. It also is part of a larger hydrologic system. The Lake Boone is fed in by multiple sources of inflow, and that's part of our study to understand that. But then through the Barton Road Dam, the water flows out into the Assabet River and then, down into Maynard and beyond. And so it's quite an integral part of this system. So our study really relates to a larger picture. The grant was funded in part because Lake Boone is illustrative. Many lakes throughout the world, throughout Massachusetts in particular, are experiencing the kind of issues that we're dealing with here. And so we're hoping that what we find will have a broader set of implications. Of course, the challenge here and the purpose of this is climate change. This is very real, very solid, very important. The types of things ranging from extreme temperatures, and this is a chart specifically for Hudson and Stow area, more days with a maximum temperature over 90 degrees, fewer days below freezing. We've seen shorter freeze cycles. We get more extreme weathers, weather events, precipitation issues. All of these come together to have climatic impact on the lake. So what we are doing with this is trying to engage as many people as possible in this study. That we have a couple of dozen volunteers. Others have helped out in various other aspects to do some scheduled monitoring of the lake. And the value is not just having the volunteers help get the data, but also helps the volunteers become more intellectually engaged with the work here. Now, I'll say this also builds on a few other pieces of work. For years, we've been doing a drawdown, which is kind of a nature-based solution to dealing with some kind of the weed incursion around the periphery of the lake. We bring down the lake during the winter, bring it back up in the spring for the summer, all of which has in fact helped us understand a bit more the dynamics of the water of the lake. Here's a picture of the weir where it outflows. We do measurements of this, and here you see Dave Gray, who's been really heroics in doing almost daily measurements so we can monitor this. It's helping us see that, the lake levels provide some important insights of the many different pathways of water getting into the lake and, evaporative impacts as well as the outflow, and understanding that in more detail is one of the goals. Another part of our prior work is our annual weed treatment. We have some discomfort that we're using some chemicals to deal with this, sonar and diquat, although they're remarkably safe. But we have issues of growth of weeds that ultimately can impact on reducing the usable areas of the lake, especially in the third and fourth basins. These are the three major types of weeds. We've been able to control them fairly well with this treatment. But these also, with more eutrophication, the impact of the weeds get greater. So for the weeding, we do prior surveys of the weeds and then develop a plan for treatment at various locations, typically in May of each year. But the challenge is now emerging as deeper than that. We're getting a growing number of algal blooms and potential cyanotoxins, especially from the bacterial growth, the cyanobacteria. Last year, that even led to closing down of the lake to avoid potential impact. People might digest some of that water, pets or young children. So this growth is really a new development that has been growing more and more, and now with climate change is certainly with higher temperatures, longer growing seasons, is likely to grow further. So with all of that as a background, we got this grant. A number of people put together the proposal. It's through the Lake Boone Commission. It features volunteers who go out and do measurements on some very specific criteria to understand the full dynamics and the chemical and biological nature of the lake. Ultimately, it will recommend actions that can be based on this knowledge. We have several goals: quantifying the water inflows and outflows, modeling the lake, understanding nutrient sources. I won't go through the full list here. As I said, it does involve measurements done with some very specific criteria. We've done training for the volunteers so that they understand not just the measurements, but the science of what we're trying to do, how to have quality control of the data we collect. We do monthly sampling. We also do, when there are high-level precipitation events, do some special case sampling in order to collect a full set of data based on scientific criteria. So Dave Gray will go through more details in his section about the very specific measurements, but it deals with temperature, dissolved oxygen, visibility, conductivity, and so on. We collect the data from multiple strategically selected locations throughout the lake. The data collection is one piece, but it's not the only one. The other piece of this is the modeling that we do to understand what the data mean. So Kirk, if you could, for this slide, and the next one is this overall modeling process, but if you could take this as a segue for you to talk about your role.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. We're going to talk a little bit, maybe for the next 10 minutes, about computer modeling, simulation modeling, which allows us to ask questions about what if, what could the lake look like in 50 years? What would it look like if the rain patterns changed? What would it look like if we applied different management measures that we haven't applied to date? And what we're able to do with the computer model that I'll talk about is simulate rainfall, simulate the way it either infiltrates into the ground or runs off over the land and eventually makes it to the lake, but brings with it the pollutants that are causing potential have caused algal growth in the past and could cause more algal growth in the future. Surface runoff, water that runs off lawns, forested areas, and so forth, brings with it nutrients from leaf litter, from fertilizers, and pet waste, and that sort of thing. Water that seeps into the ground and makes its way into the lake through the ground brings with it other forms of pollutants that often can be traced back to septic systems if they're not well maintained, and even septic systems that are working well. So it's important for us to be able to know what the water does when it falls, because different forms of water entering the lake bring with it different types of pollutants. That's what the computer model helps us do. I think the next slide here, Dan, talks about our 3 steps in the computer modeling process. The first is to understand the water flow. We can't really understand the flow of pollutants into and out of the lake and what they do while they're in the lake unless we have a good understanding of how much water is flowing in from different sources, from surface water, from groundwater, and how much is flowing out. That the difference there is how long the water stays in and how much of any given pollutant it brings with it. Step 2, we'll look at what we call eutrophication potential, and that is really determining how close the lake is to becoming unhealthy as an aquatic ecosystem. How much growth potential is there, and is there enough to potentially deplete the water column of oxygen levels that are needed to maintain a healthy ecosystem. And then the third step is actually looking at the dynamics of the water quality. What happens when different pollutants enter the lake? How long do they stay? How do they interact with one another? How do pollutants come out of the sediment from one year to the next? And basically, what kind of risks do these pose? And then the last question we can ask with all of these tools together is, what happens when the climate actually does change? And we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about some of the scenarios that we'll look at with these tools.
Thanks, Kirk. I also just want to comment that we're very fortunate to have Kirk as a resident of the lake. Not only are you representing Brown Caldwell as an organization, but also you love the lake. And so you're out there constantly putting your heart and soul into this. So I want to thank you for that extra effort. I'll just do one more slide to remind us that the purpose of this is not simply to study the lake, but to take action to help us maintain the health of the lake over the long run. This is a 1-year data collection grant, but it's a decades-long process that we're all dealing with to confront climate change. One example of that action, I saw that Larry Smith was on, and Larry, thank you for your help in this, was the fundraising done by Stow and Hudson and the Lake Boone community especially to protect this important resource, the Halleck Point, which we successfully raised sufficient dollars to acquire this with help from the Stow residents to protect it as a key piece of our action. There will be others, but I just wanted to remind us that our goal is to have action, not simply to collect data. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Kirk.
Okay. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Can people see that okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. Some of the slides I have are similar to Dan's, and so we'll move through those a little more quickly, perhaps. I'm not able to advance these. Let's see. Why is that? There we go. One of the most important things that we need to remember when we embark on a study like this is that part of it is science and part of it is art. As Dan said, we are trying to understand the dynamics of this lake and this watershed better than we do today. And a lot of that comes from observation. Dave is going to talk a lot about the kinds of measurements we've been taking in the lake, both of flow and of the kind of pollutant concentrations we're seeing in the lake. And then there's what we calculate. This is where we apply some science, make some estimates and some assumptions, and see if we can replicate what we're measuring. And if we can replicate what we're measuring, we know we've got the dynamics, at least our minds wrapped around the dynamics enough to be able to ask some what if questions. The art then is combining those two things. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we've been applying this art to educate ourselves about this lake as we go by combining what we've observed with what we calculate. And that is the story that the lake is going to tell. So the modeling, as Dan said, is one piece of telling this story. And the story then ultimately leads to Dan's conclusion just a minute ago. What do we do? How do we act? What actions do we take? We talked about this already, the 3 steps in the modeling. So let me jump ahead a little bit and talk a little bit about why understanding the water flow is so important, right? We're here talking about water quality and algae blooms and the risks that poses and how climate change could affect all of that. Well, why is the flow of water so important to that? A few minutes ago, we talked about the different kinds of ways that water enters the lake. It enters the lake by flowing over our lawns and forested areas along the lake. It enters the lake through the groundwater by infiltrating and can bring septic seepage with it. It also enters the lake just by falling directly on the lake. And it's important to understand those relative differences. It's also important to understand what kinds of pollution are coming in, where the water is coming from to bring the pollutants in the way it does, and how long the water stays in the lake. That's important in order to understand how the pollutants interact with each other and how the sediments can potentially release pollutants from the lake. So the model is basically a combination of all of the simulated inflows and outflows of the lake. And we simulate the entire watershed so that we're looking at the land uses, the way the water infiltrates, the way it flows directly off lawns and forested areas and that sort of thing. It moves through the groundwater. This is important because it's driven by 2 climate variables. It's driven by precipitation on a daily basis and air temperature. Air temperature affects the evaporation within the watershed and from the water surface. And precipitation, of course, changes the amount of water that flows into the lake. As those 2 variables change with different climate patterns, we'll see different response patterns in the lake, both to the normal types of nutrient loads that come into the lake and also to our potential management measures. So the fact that the model is driven by 2 climate variables that we can experiment with as if they were dials, turning them up and down, or changing the way they're organized in time and space, will allow us to look forward in time and say, how will this lake respond to potential climate change scenarios? What we have so far has taught us a lot. What you're looking at is last year's recorded lake levels. These were taken by Dave Gray, as Dan said, almost on a daily basis. Those are the blue dots on this graph. The blue dots from April through October represent the lake filling back up in the spring to just over 3 feet, and then gradually declining through the summer, filling back up again in the fall after a large storm, and then that drawdown at the end. The orange line represents the model's prediction of those lake levels based on precipitation and air temperature. And it simulates, again, the water flowing over the land and through the soil into the lake and the outflow at the weir. And we look at that and we say, wow, that's a pretty good representation. We can be fairly confident that we've got those dynamics nailed pretty well, that we understand the inflows from these different sources. There's a problem with that, though, and that's that it was completely wrong. The volunteer work becomes so valuable. We learned that our understanding of the lake hydrology was wrong because of the observations that our volunteers have made with their eyes. Every month we go out, and after every rainstorm we go out, and we measure the flow in the one surface stream that feeds this lake. And that's the stream, the watershed that you see at the bottom of this picture here that feeds into Monaghan's Cove. It's about 20% of the land area of the Lake Boone watershed, but it turns out to be a significant portion of the actual volume of water flows into the lake. It drains a golf course. There's potential there for some excess nutrients in the spring and potentially the fall. And it also just drains residential and industrial neighborhoods. And so we're measuring that very closely because it's become a much more prominent feature in the hydrology of the lake than we had assumed. Based on last year's modeling results, we assumed that almost 90 or more % of the water in the lake comes from groundwater. And that would have some significant implications to how we might manage different things in the watershed. Our conclusions this year is that that balance is significantly different, that maybe 20 or 30% of the water in the lake comes from the surface, from that one small basin. And that's a really important finding because it directs our attention to the pollution sources that are actually affecting the lake. And we have our volunteers to thank for that. So this is what's really happening within the watershed. If you look at everything that contributes to the lake outside of that small shaded blue area, which is the surface stream that drains into Monaghan's Cove, You see the graph on the left. The orange line is the simulated groundwater inflow to the lake, and the blue line is the simulated surface water flow into the lake from every acre that isn't included in that shaded area. And you can see that models predicting that most of the water from that, the rest of the watershed is coming from groundwater. If you look at the graph on the right, you see the blue line and the orange line are completely reversed. This is the shaded blue, smaller watershed that feeds Monaghan's Cove with surface water. And we've been measuring that flow using stopwatches and orange peels, which is a time-tested way of actually measuring flow, velocity, and volume in rivers with some confidence. It seems old-fashioned, but it works. And these little blue dots are measurements superimposed over the simulated flow in that stream. And it's become very clear to us that that's a very significant portion of the flow, and that in that portion of the basin, the hydrology is completely flipped on its head. It's not dominated by groundwater, it's dominated by surface water. And that was a really important finding. So much so that during the tropical storm recently, the photo there on the top shows that the culvert that feeds the cove was completely submerged. There was a lot of flow. It was torrents of flow. We estimated about 8.5 or 9 million gallons a day. When on a regular day, the photo on the bottom is a much more reasonable or common type of occurrence for the surface water. But because it's not obvious, it took the work of our volunteers to identify this as a significant source of flow into the lake. So what do we do with this now? Right? We understand that in 2021, we've seen a significant contribution of surface water that's going to bring with it nutrients from pet waste, from lawn fertilizers, from leaf litter, grass clippings, and things like that. And we also see a significant portion of flow coming into the lake from groundwater in the rest of the basin. That's going to bring with it different kinds of contaminants. That's where septic seepage can enter the lake. The balance between the green and the blue here is almost equal for 2021. That's because we got 12 inches of rain in July. I think just the first 2.5 weeks in July. In a normal year, the green would be maybe a third of the pie rather than a quarter of the pie. So we've recalibrated. We've combined those two. We've broken the model up into two submodels. One that's studying the groundwater dynamics in the majority of the basin, and one that studies and focuses on the surface water dynamics in Monaghan's Cove. And we're able to replicate the elevations of the lake this year. So it gives us confidence that we can move forward and ask some what-if questions using the model. So this is where I'll stop and turn it over to Dave in just a minute. But we started this conversation on the topic of climate change. And I've just shared with you the development of a tool that's based on historical data. How do we match historical data about the lake? Well, that's useful in helping us understand maybe what's going on today, but not so much about what might be going on in 50 years. But once we have confidence that the model is replicating the hydrology and the water quality dynamics well enough, we can start to ask what-if questions. This is just an example. This is not an actual test yet. This is an example climate change scenario where we have simulated a summer in which no rain happens at all. And we've had summers very similar to that very recently. 2016 was a good example, just 5 years in the past, the onset of a drought. We've also simulated a 3 degrees Celsius increase in air temperature throughout that summer. So just a what-if question. What if the climate, we're not trying to predict a climate future with any specificity. We're asking, what if the climate were to do X, Y, and Z? And in this case, we've simulated the summer with no rain and 3 degrees warmer. And what I want to point your attention or call your attention to is the two green lines, the solid green line and the shaded green line, or the dotted green line. The solid green line represents simulated outflow of the lake at the weir that Dan showed you during a normal summer. And the dashed green line represents what that outflow would look like during that climate scenario, if we were to basically turn off the spigots of the rain and experience a 3 degree increase in temperature. And what we see is that there's no outflow at all, that the water flows into the lake and stays there throughout the summer. What that means is that all the pollution accumulates in the summer. There's nothing flushing it out or letting it go out. And so what we'll do is ask the water quality model when we develop that, what does that mean? What does it mean if the pollution has no way out? What does it mean if the nutrients continue to build up and accumulate in the lake? What does that mean for the risk of algal blooms in the future and potential other risks of toxicity associated with the algae? That's the kind of thing that we'll be studying with the model. And it's, as you've seen, so vitally important that we have the volunteer data to be able to have confidence to build these models so that we can look ahead and ask ourselves, what could our lake look like in 40 years and 50 years if the climate trends in certain directions? So let me turn it over to Dave, and Dave will talk about the valuable work that the volunteers are doing, collecting the flow data that I talked about here to help us understand the hydrology of the lake. And he's also going to talk about the water quality constituents that have become so important in our understanding of actual risks and threats to the lake's water quality. Dave?
So as we transition over to Dave, let me just say, Kirk, you have gracefully acknowledged the support of the volunteers, and that's absolutely a central part of engaging people and so on. But I also want to say the modeling is really key. And what you presented, every time I see it, we get more and more nuances. This is an evolving, sophisticated climate model that makes the climate impact so real because it aligns with actual data in our lake in the backyard of, in Stow. So it moves it from an abstraction to a real concrete reality.
Right. And with that, we'll be able to test different management measures and have a sense of which ones might be the most practical and beneficial for the lake. So Dave, we'll turn it over to you. I think you're on mute.
Okay, let me get started here. Let's see, where are we? Okay. Yeah, are we on screen there?
We are. We're good.
Okay, good. This was in a very small view of Kirk's, one of Kirk's slides. And when we talk about climate change, this was really brought home here. I took these two photographs, and this was after Storm Elsa. And this was completely full. This culvert was down about a foot, so that this red line across here is the water level that it was after the tropical storm. So you can get an idea of how much effect a large rainfall has. And if these start coming more frequently, it could be very, even a structural problem for something like this. So it really brought home very vividly what climate effects do. Now, Kirk talked so much about these measurements of water flow, where it comes from, where it goes. And so now I want to transition and say, well, what is in the water? And more than a year ago, the Lake Boone Association purchased an instrument that is capable of measuring dissolved oxygen, temperature, and conductivity, or the ability of the water to conduct electricity, which is directly proportional to the amount of minerals in the water. So we purchased this instrument so that we can actually take profiles through the depth of the lake. The deepest area of the lake is about 22 feet, and a lot of it is much less than that, more maybe on the order of 9 or 10 feet. But this sensor can be lowered down, and we, in our monthly sampling, have been taking profiles of these measurements as we go along. And the striking thing is that the temperature in particular helps identify the stratification of the lake. That is, that the heavy part of the lake, or the heavier, denser water stays at the bottom during most of the year. And of course, the warmer water is less dense, floats at the surface. And so we can use that temperature to identify stratification. And here are some data from the different areas at different seasons. And you can see In the April here, it's fairly uniform temperature. There's not much stratification, but as you get into later in the year, there's a big difference in temperature as you go deeper. And those of you who swim in the water can actually sense that very directly. The interesting thing with water is that when it gets really cold in the wintertime, water has its maximum density at 4 degrees C, and that's one of the things that contributes to the turnover of lakes. So there actually is a turnover of the water, and that stratification disappears, and if anything, it goes into reverse. So there is mixing of the lake twice a year very thoroughly. But in addition to that, the other things that get stratified by temperature are the dissolved oxygen, because the water is not moving around very much during the summer in particular. The warm water stays on top, bottom water stays on the bottom. And at the bottom, especially in a lake that is a kind of a pond and part of it has been flooded, it has a lot of organics on the bottom, which tends to consume oxygen. Those leaves and pine needles and pine cones and weeds that have died are consuming oxygen at the bottom. And what we find is that if the bottom gets completely depleted of oxygen, it's very unhealthy, but also it changes the chemistry of the materials that bond phosphorus. And phosphates can be released from the bottom. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But anyway, the dissolved oxygen is probably the most important measurement that we make going through the different levels. And this has been modeled and or graphed to identify how that oxygen goes down. And what you can see is here's 0 dissolved oxygen in milligrams per liter. As you get down to, this is 20 feet deep, it's right down there near 0 in June. Here back in April, the oxygen was nice and high all the way up and down the water column. So it is quite an important measurement, and we do see some dramatic seasonal differences. And of course, seasonal differences could be magnified by climate change. So the periods when the oxygen goes low could be extended to longer periods of time, and that will have some major effect. We also monitor for suspended solids, which is just basically how much kind of sediment is so light that it stays up in the column. But we can also make a quick optical measurement with what's known as a Secchi disk, which is just this black and white disk lowered over the side of the boat, and you measure how deep you can still see it. And it's a very quick, easy way to see how clear the water is. And we've seen some pretty clear water so far this summer. It's come and gone as algae and sediment goes, but it has ranged significantly. And then these are the indications of the Secchi depth that we could see going through the seasons.
One thing to mention about that we do our measurements on a Sunday afternoon when we have the quiet time when boats aren't on the lake, so it diminishes the impact of the stirring of the motors on the lake. Yeah,
good point. And then the total suspended solids is a more quantitative measurement that is made by taking samples into the laboratory. And so we get similar results there. And then finally, we measure conductivity. And that is an indication of the amount of minerals that are coming into the lake. And I should mention at this point that there have been 3 major lake studies previous to this, going back to 1979, I believe. So we have data that we can look at over many decades. And we've actually found that the lake has become higher in dissolved minerals. And so we're looking into that, seeing what is upstream in the tributaries, what may be coming in through the groundwater. to determine just where that is and see what remedial action can be taken. So this specific conductance or conductivity is a higher number than we saw 20 or 30 years ago. So it's really good to have this historical background to look at. And so again, we've done some comparisons of the conductivity, and not only just with a few months, but with decades. And it is quite significant. And so those were the measurements that are taken with that instrument that we can take profiles of. Then we also take bottle samples. That is where we grab a sample with a bottle, we preserve it, have it preserved and cooled, and take it to the laboratory. And phosphorus is the most important nutrient that can affect the growth of algae and weeds in the lake. And so that's a critical thing. And again, the source of phosphorus is in fertilizer. Some dishwashing detergents still have some phosphorus in, but it's getting better. Pet waste, septic systems, there's no lack of possible sources of the phosphorus. And again, we've been monitoring that closely to see just where the effect is. Barbara Clancy was very instrumental in getting a TMDL, which was a total maximum daily load of phosphorus that is appropriate for the lake. And they look closely at that, and we are able to use their report again to review in context with what we're seeing today. And then finally, we mentioned that the dissolved oxygen at the bottom of the lake can cause, or the lack of dissolved oxygen can cause the release of more phosphorus just out of the sediment. And so to study that, we contracted with the UMass Dartmouth School of Marine Science and Technology to actually send divers down and take core samples. So they actually have gone down into the mud and sand on the bottom, taken core samples, which then go back to their laboratory, and they incubate this over very carefully controlled conditions to lower the dissolved oxygen and then raise it slowly, and to see how much and how quickly phosphorus is released from these core samples. So this is a real important study that is it's underway now. It should be coming to the conclusion very shortly, but this goes on for like 3 months to simulate a season of depleted oxygen at the bottom of the lake, and actually do it in the laboratory and be able to see the direct result of lack of oxygen causing release of phosphorus. So this is a finding we're really anxious to see the results of. Yet another measurement is checking chlorophyll, which is an indication. Of course, chlorophyll is in everything that's green, and it's in algae, it's in cyanobacteria, and it's in the weeds too, but we can measure the microscopic amounts by taking just samples of the water. And that gives us a good handle. And this can then be correlated with some of the other measurements, such as the cyanobacteria. And it will allow us to see the characteristics of this particular lake and how these things interact. In addition to that, we're measuring several different forms of nitrogen as nitrate, nitrite, total geldol nitrogen, and even as ammonia. And there can be traces of all of these forms of nitrogen in its different forms as it decays and oxidizes. And so we're getting that as background, as this fixed nitrogen then is another nutrient that contributes to the growth of the weeds and algae. And again, we've plotted this over the seasons, and we're getting a good idea of how that behaves and how these concentrations change. So this is just a quick summary slide of all the different measurements that we're making. The first have to do all with flows in and out of the lake. And then the profile measurements here with that instrument that we have, and the Psyche depth and conductivity, and then the other materials in the lake as well. So these are all important measurements, and it comes together to paint a pretty good picture of what we have going on in the lake, so that more accurate conclusions can be reached. So I think that's about the end of what I wanted to cover here. Do you want to take it back?
Yeah, why don't we now handle questions? Thank you, Dave and Kirk, but let's open it up for questions. And I think, Rick, maybe if you can be the MC to field any.
Certainly. Looking for questions now. I have one just to start. As you may say, well, this is completely off the topic, but I was wondering as I watched, and I thought about the changes in the water quality and so forth as you were talking. How does that impact? And I'm out of my depth. Sorry, bad pun here. But I mean, how does that impact the life, the biologic life in the lake? And other systems, maybe amphibians, maybe birds, fish, that depend on that life. Are you taking any measures of that?
Kirk or David, do you want to?
Dave, do you want to lead off and I'll follow up?
Well, one of the factors that is being taken into account now is that increase in dissolved minerals in the water, that as the salinity essentially increases in the water, it does have an effect on, I believe, Kirk, you had said invertebrates.
Macroinvertebrates.
At invertebrates, yeah. At Brown and Caldwell, they have experts who recognize the implications there. And yeah, did you have more that you wanted to add, Kirk?
Yeah, I think you said it well earlier, Dave, that one of the most important measures that we're taking is of dissolved oxygen. It doesn't only tell us what the nutrient cycle looks like within the lake. It tells us a little bit about the suitability of the lake as habitat. As oxygen is depleted, you expect to see it depleted at the bottom of a lake in the summer. A lake that's 20 feet deep, you'd expect that. We're seeing that the oxygen is starting to deplete well above the bottom. And that's sort of a sign of a deteriorating aquatic habitat. So the fish, we can't breathe the oxygen in the water, but the fish can. And all the critters that live in the lake depend on that oxygen. And if it's being depleted well above the bottom levels, that's something that we want to look at carefully and see if we could reverse, because that is a sign of a deteriorating habitat.
Yeah, I think, Rick, that was a really perceptive question. And I think it underscores that we're trying to view this as a gestalt. It's the whole lake. It's everything around. It's not just is the algae impacting the closing of the beach, but really is it as a habitat overall.
It goes back to the different uses that we talked about at the beginning. Barbara, you may have noted that earlier, the different uses of the lake. It's a recreational water body, it's an aesthetic water body, and it's also a habitat for a lot of people and animals.
Sharon, you had your hand up?
Yeah, and I may have missed something earlier, but I wanted to, so this is basically the study has the grant. And I just some context around how long is the grant going on and how long will this measurement going on? And when it ends, you continue monitoring the lake and measuring it. And then the third, I'm asking a lot of questions in one. What is the goal or objective after you've got all this great data? And I think, Dave, you mentioned helps to take action. And have you taken action already? And what actions do you anticipate in the future?
Yeah, so why don't I start with some answers and then Kirk and Dave can add on to that. First, you were asking about the nature and the grant. It's a 2-year grant. We're now halfway through the sort of middle year. The first part of it is preparing, figuring out, making sure we've got the team, what things we want to measure, getting our contracts in place. This part going on now is a full season from spring to winter, end of winter to beginning of winter of data collection. And then there's the analysis and recommendations that happen out of that. However, this fits into a longer time sequence. There were numerous studies done before this, and we want to continue studies after this. What we're doing is taking this opportunity to do the most intensive, comprehensive, multifaceted, integrated set of observations so we can build our model, and then in the future have a subset of those that will be able to continue. The YSI device that Dave has used is very useful. We now own it and we can have volunteers do it. We're not sort of incurring additional costs. There may be some cost for some lab tests of things, monitoring chlorophyll, if that's the best bioindicator, but we want to continue that for decades to come. Then you were also asking about the goal, and I'll go back to the single goal is how can we help maintain the health of the lake over the long run, especially as climate change intensifies the factors that we've already discussed, the precipitation, temperature, and so on. Yes, collect the data. Yes, understand. But what we found, really, if you look back, 10, 20, 30 years, we had studies and they said, probably this might be having some impact, but they weren't thorough enough to make true solid recommendations that are backed up by the models and the data. So now from this, we'll have the ability to define, actions that are really substantively understanding this deeper model.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit and say that there's no magic button that will make these problems go away. But the modeling and the data that we have will really educate us and help us create a more educated community so that we'll know, where do we spend our effort? Is it educating citizens about pet waste and fertilizers, or is it educating more about septic system maintenance and that sort of thing? And do we evaluate other options for waste? One of the things that the grant encourages, the whole program encourages, what's called nature-based solutions. And these are sort of natural solutions or management measures that Dan touched on one earlier. The drawdown of the lake is a natural means of helping to control plant growth along the fringes. And that helps keep organic productivity in the lake down. We would also look at some of the things that we have found regarding some of the other culverts. We've shown you the big culvert that drains a lot of water, surface water in the lake. There are two other culverts coming under Sudbury Road from the Wildlife Reserve that are blocked. And what would improve in the lake in terms of fresh water flushing through if those were unblocked and restored to their working condition? Those are the kinds of things and recommendations that the study will produce.
I saw, I think it was Larry. Larry,
Yes,
you
I
had
have a
your hand up
question.
a minute ago.
Thanks, Rick. First of all, great presentation, guys, and it shows you take a very good approach to this. So thank you very much for your efforts. And could you hear me okay?
Mhm.
Great. So I have two questions. The first is, now that we determined that the water coming to Monahan's Cove is a larger percentage than you thought before, and if I missed this, I apologize. Has there been any testing of the water before it gets to Monahan's Cove? In other words, upstream at all?
The short answer is yes. I'll let Dave expand on that a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah, we did a little bushwhacking. Started out at Monahan's Cove and then the culvert upstream. And then we could go in through the railroad tracks. There's an old set of railroad tracks still there. And there's a culvert where the stream goes under the railroad tracks. There's a branch that goes off to the through the middle of the golf course. And then another one goes off to the side of the golf course. And then it goes behind some industrial areas too. So we are trying to get more measurements up there. We've taken a few, but it looks like it's worthwhile. We're learning a little bit about what's coming in.
And not to jump to conclusions, but is there any indication that the fertilization that comes off of the golf course off of Charter Oak is making its way to the lake?
I believe there was some indication that in the spring, when they fertilized the grass, there was some. I don't think it was sustained for very long, but that's something we will probably want to look at more frequently next spring.
And does a golf course have an order of conditions that dictates what type of fertilization they can and cannot use?
They do. Yeah, enacted through Hudson, they do. And, before we point all the fingers at the golf course, that certainly, and there also, by the way, were a lot of geese in that area when we were looking at it. So, it may not just be the golf fertilizer, but we've also, and Dave gets the sleuthing credit here, tracked down a place where there's a lot of rock salt stored that is for larger distribution around the state for in the winter. And in fact, some of that seeps into the lake, we believe, causing some, very high levels of conductivity and, mineral infusion into the lake. We can't draw that conclusion officially yet, but it certainly is something that also impacts on Monaghan.
Great, good investigation work.
What I think we can say officially is that the water is being monitored in the stream before it gets to the lake, and there are some indications of elevated levels of contaminants coming in from the river. Tracing it back to specific sources will require some more work, but we do see those elevated levels before the water reaches the lake.
Great, thank you. And my second question and last question, is there any, and again, this is not jumping to any kind of conclusion, but the circular motion of the boats and the jet skis around the lake, and what I think is churn, or is there churn? How does that affect the testing? And should that be measured during busy times in a lake, or and what good will it do anyway? If there could some conclusion could come from the high usage of the ski boats, wave runners and water skiers.
Couple thoughts on that, Larry. One is that the density of water doesn't change with all the boat traffic, and the heavier water is going to still remain on the bottom during those times, and it's not going to churn enough to get that water back up to the surface. And we've been able to confirm that by seeing that the dissolved oxygen really does change consistently throughout the summer with all the boat activity. As you go deeper, the oxygen gets lower and lower and lower, even following weeks of intense boat activity, such as last week. So that's one thought. I think the other thing is that the activity does help to create some uniformity of concentrations near the surface. And so it makes the choice of where we sample a little bit less important, a little bit less specific, I guess I should say. The boats do stir up the top layer of water. That's healthy for the lake. It doesn't allow concentrations to accumulate in a specific area. I see that as almost a benefit in terms of distributing the load and creating for us as scientists a little bit less need for precise location of sampling locations, because we know and we've seen that there's a lot of uniformity in the top layers.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, to add to this stratification idea, I think everybody on this call is old enough to remember lava lamps. So if you think of a lava lamp that has been turned off, you have a heavy layer at the bottom, and you could rock it back and forth, but it would always stay at the bottom. And that's very much the way, kind of a model of what the temperature does to water with its changing density.
I still have one, Dave.
Okay.
Well, unless there are other questions here, I'd like to actually do a reverse question to this group. Actually, before doing that, I just want to acknowledge Dick Gelbke is here. Dick has just finished a book on Lake Boone that will be released in the next week or so. And Dick, as an earth scientist, has been along, Barbara and others have been working on the lake for many years. So I just want to be clear that this project is a highly focused, but it builds on a rich background. So I just want to acknowledge them. But to flip the question back to Sustainable Stow, how can this project help you, or how can you help us deal with the climate connections within Stow and Hudson?
Well, actually, I had one more question, but maybe it ties into the question that you just asked. And that was, as urban planning is done, sometimes they'll look at open space and they'll sort of try to quantify the environmental benefits from leaving open space open as opposed to developing it. And I was wondering if the grant actually looks at sort of the environmental benefits of a healthy lake as part of, why do we want to work so hard to implement some of the recommendations? Well, because we get, there's like a habitat aspect of it. There's a recreational aspect where people maybe don't have to travel a great distance to swim or to fish or to boat. There might be like a cooling aspect, there might be a health aspect or whatever. And I'm wondering if that's part of the grant, or will, and if not, is there some way to kind of raise up some of those issues to sort of build consensus across the town that we really need to take care of the lake?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Barbara. And I think, the grant is a very focused infusion of resources, people, data, expertise, and so on. But the MVP program per se, but also Stow and Hudson, have both been absolutely clear this has to fit into a larger perspective. Mm-hmm. So Stow and Hudson both have their climate resiliency plans developed through their sort of town-wide MVP grants. We've got our steering committee has representatives from ORS and some of the other sort of regional environmental perspectives, and any action has to be integrated into a larger set of plans and recognition of the benefits. I think we'll give an example of the way that the town was to approve acquisition of the Halleck Point Peninsula as a broader recognition that this isn't just for residents who like to boat around and want to see trees instead of houses. This is essential for the environment of, Stow and Hudson and the regional areas. And that recognition led to the near unanimous approval of town funds for this and so on. So I think, your point is very well taken, and we need to make sure that we don't sort of this is a bubble, a peak of a curve of action, but it's just one piece, and it's a broader perspective we have here.
And I'll add to that just a little bit. First of all, the Halleck's Point is a great example of a nature-based solution. Preserving that 11 acres is a great example of that ethic. Secondly, Barbara, to your question, I'll just add to what Dan said. One of the tasks that we've been scoped to handle is a health assessment of the lake. So taking all of the data that we collect from the measurements, from the modeling, from the analysis, and producing an assessment. So in addition to the primary output of the grant, which will be the climate impacts and risks to water quality and usability of the lake, a sort of derivative product of this grant work will be a health assessment. And we'll look at the things that we've been talking about tonight, the chloride levels in the lake. What does that do to the ecosystem? The oxygen levels in the lake. We'll compare that to what they looked like 20 years ago and 40 years ago. Is it trending in the right direction for the aquatic ecosystem or not? And that will be part of the deliverable. And I think it's in those eyes, it's not just the usability or the potential toxicity of the lake based on algal blooms. It is what else have we learned about it and its trends as we look toward the future, and is climate likely to make these trends worse or better? And that will help guide our decisions and recommendations, but it'll also paint a pretty accurate picture of the current health assessment, not just as a snapshot, but as a trend.
So a minute ago, Dan asked a question of, how does Sustainable Stow work with this study? And I think that's a great question. And we need to learn more about how we can work with it. I can say that our general view as Sustainable Stow is very broad. We're not just a technology group. We're not just a garden group or a conservation group or something. We're concerned about the ecosystem that is Stow and how it's changing over time, what people need to know about it, and anything that we can do in this generation and the next to maintain the most livable climate here. We're concerned about towns around us in the state and the world as a whole too, but we'll start here. So how do we maintain the most livable climate here? And so, the work that you're doing in your study is directly related to that. Sharon or Barbara, would you add something to that? And is that a reasonable response?
Sharon, you're muted.
I think the other thing is that we in Stow are pretty privileged. We don't have the fires of the West. We haven't got a flood like other parts of the country. And so there's, I think there may be not as much of a concern of what's happening in the climate. It's a little distant. And I think the research that you have done in saying it's not distant. It actually impacts what we're doing. And so as we start really pushing for the town to get a Stow climate action plan, people have got to take this pretty seriously because it is going to start impacting us. It's going to start impacting the quality of our life. It's going to start impacting the whole ecosystem, the animals we see, the gardeners that we are. What's our gardening season like? What are we having to deal with? And how predictable is the weather? And your detailed study is just amazing in terms of there's a lot of implications here. I mean, from your sediment, from the runoff, from that, and you've got science to back it up. So I think that that's definitely a way of bringing it home to people here. As we are going forward, because this is going to get more and more serious and people are going to have to take it seriously. They're going to have to start changing behavior. And
there's a flip side of this. So I think you both here, Rick and Sharon, you're both very articulate in expressing that, how we ground it in this example. Yet there's a risk that on this project, that we say, the solution is to raise and lower the lake or to have a sprinkler that'll get the water circulating. But all those are very local solutions and not getting at the core problem, which is a global problem of climate. Right. And I think what you're adding to this equation is that what we do is not simply to have a sprinkler or whatever it is that we need to change our use of energy and all of the other things that broadly deal with climate change that are sort of decades in impact, not how do we protect our own local lake. So you help, I think, us keep that global context as well as the local example.
Barbara, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's a very good summing up of how we're all working together in this, and how we all should be working together on this.
I think it would be great to have another conversation a little further on towards the end of your study. We will have learned more, all of us, in various aspects of the climate. And what, if we were to talk again, would that be in 6 months?
We're happy to talk with you whenever you'd like. I think I'm trying to think of timing. We want to make sure, I would think the most useful thing might be a little bit longer than that. We want to make sure that we have completed our modeling, our analysis, and our first pass at the recommendations. So it, might be, more like 9 months or something, but I think we should, we're neighbors, so we'll just keep in contact over this. But as we get more clarity, we think it'd be useful. It would be a great time to come back again.
Great.
Great. Thank you. You may see some questions on Stow TV. Thank you, Stow TV. You may see some on Facebook. And we'll try to keep this going.
And please, this is a public project. We're happy to answer any questions in whatever venue seems to be the right way. So encourage people to, contact us directly or through you. However, we're happy to field questions anytime.
Great.
Well,
And
thank you for your
ideas.
work. This is a great effort. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for
Wonderful
being here.
Thank you.
wonderful presentation.
Thanks for
Thank
taking
you.
the time tonight.
And thanks, Sustainable Stow, for all that you're doing. It's important.
Great. Thank you.